There's this point in chapter 16 of the first Fire Emblem game where two villages are sitting right next to each other with both containing a playable unit. The left village grants you a paladin named Arran and the right village grants you a hero named Samson. Both the kinds of pre-promotes you'd expect to see in this stage of a Fire Emblem game. But of course there's a catch. The two villages once got into a very heated argument over who won the Batman vs Sherlock Holmes epic rep battle of history, and at least 20 lives were claimed on that day, so there's still some bad blood between them. Visiting one village means you can't visit the other one, so you have to choose between the two units. There's plenty of different angles you could take in regards to this choice. When comparing bases, Samson has 2 more points of strength, 6 more points of skill, and 4 more points of speed, while Arran has just 1 more point of defense. But maybe you'd get more value from Arran's higher movement and more reliable 1-2 range. Or you could look at their growths and decide from there. There's also the possibility that you already have a paladin or hero trained up and want to go with the one you don't already have. Alternatively, you could compare inventories and go with Arran because he comes with a Rider's Bane, whereas Samson's Vulnerary is far easier to come by. And wait, why don't I just go with Samson because it's less walking? I'm not going to pretend to have an idea of who is the better unit or really just know that much about the tier list of any given FE game beyond obvious top tiers and bottom tiers. The point here is that you are given 2 distinct options that both have their respective pros and cons, at least if you haven't done enough playthroughs to fully scrutinize the meta. Regardless of whether you go with Arran or Samson, something will be lost. And from this single choice, an entire Fire Emblem archetype was spawned. The secret to being an FE fan is that it's really just the lamer version of being a Gundam fan, and most FE archetypes feel like an attempt to have a similar label to Char clone without the level of history and legacy that would warrant that kind of terminology existing. I can get archetypes like Jagans, the Christmas Calves, and the Pegasus Trio since they're actively invoked and played with throughout the series. I mean, who can forget when Awakening killed off what would have been your third Pegasus Knight, and FE fans everywhere collectively gasped before saying, "Wait, who was she again?" But so many FE archetypes are for narrative roles that can be described using broader fantasy archetypes and/or mechanical roles that can be described by stating the unit's join time and starting class. For instance, look at the Julian archetype, which can easily be substituted for either early game thief or the more general image of the honor roll thief that's existed for centuries if not millennia before this nerd shit. The attempt to add more criteria through their connection to another supposed archetype just gets in the way of comparisons. Patty is included despite not having a connection of this sort, Home is excluded because its similar connection to Nami isn't with the exact archetype, and the words Lithus and honorable should never be used in the same sentence. Like, as a character whose dynamic with Thracia's supposed Lena is out of an ulterior motive, Lithus is the kind of active subversion I could see justifying the existence of these kinds of classifications. Though, even then, it's so much easier to just say, usually thieves in Fire Emblem are honorable, but Lithus isn't that, adding to the desperation that Leaf feels in Mancer Escape, then assume whoever you're talking to knows what the fuck a Julian is. Renek is a similar subversion, just swap actively predatory for hating his 9 to 5, but the additional criteria for an archetype really just gets in the way of those comparisons. Though, what endears me to the Arran-Samson archetype is that it's something you just can't boil down to either a join time starting class or a pre-existing fantasy archetype. The criteria of 2 units that you pick between is simultaneously something specific enough to Fire Emblem that classifying it would be useful and broad enough to mean that every Arran-Samson pair is going to be completely different. This is seen as early as Gaiden, where the Arran-Samson pair is a Myrmidon named Deen and a mage named Sonya. And while Deen's class line is pretty easy to see as the Gaiden equivalent to an FE1 hero, Sonya's class is a drastic shift away from Arran's. These two are encountered in Act 3 where they're working for the Pirate Reef and aren't exactly loyal, so Celica decides to use that to her advantage, taking out just one of their armies and allowing the other to flee. And upon Grief's defeat, the unit you don't kill ends up joining Celica. What makes this choice interesting is how it ties into Celica's role in Gaiden, that of a pacifist being forced into violence, making it so that one of the bosses destroyed on Celica's path could have been a playable unit if she chose differently, inherently gives them a more human face and hammers in the desperate situation that Celica is in. Mystery of the Emblem Book 1, a remake of FE1, keeps the Arran-Samson choice as is. Book 2, on the other hand, does not have an equivalent choice, but features the characters of Arran and Samson and uses them in fairly interesting ways. Arran joins in the first chapter of the game and serves as a Jagan. A big component of Book 1 is Marth being thrust into situations where he ends up losing or at the very least having complications with former allies and starting you out with all sword units versus all land. I mean, a unit who is associated with a choice that locks you out of another unit sets the tone for this journey. There is even a house in the starting chapter that reveals that Arran is slowly being killed by a disease, which further adds to this idea of losing allies. Samson appears much later in the game, in chapter 17. In this chapter, Marth is pitted against Shima, the princess of Gra and the daughter of the man who betrayed his kingdom. But since Gra is in a pretty dismal state and is ultimately being used as a pawn to much larger powers, Marth is able to get her on his side by going out of his way to spare her troops. And Samson is there too, as a mercenary she hired and can also recruit to your side. His inclusion and the chapter as a whole have this feeling of irony, where within this journey, colored by the loss of former allies, long-standing grudges can be put aside, be it Alte and Gra or those two villages from all the way back in FE1. Genealogy's Arran-Samson is a pair of axe units named Johan and Johalvier, one mounted and the other infantry, who show up at the beginning of Gen 2. Whereas most Arran-Samson splits are between characters who are distinct in some way, Johan and Johalvier are brothers, which means they have the same upbringing, similar designs and classes, and a shared motivation of winning the affections of the playable unit Larsae. The primary difference between the two of them is that whereas Johalvier's recruitment conversation and his dialogue in general have some focus on his rejection of his family's actions in addition to his crush, Johan is so self-absorbed that his existence almost entirely revolves around the latter of those two. He even makes Larsae actively uncomfortable in their recruitment conversation compared to Johalvier's, where she sees eye to eye with him. Probably the least remarkable pair in this video, with one being a comic relief character who doesn't have enough dialogue for the joke at his expense to really land, and the other being standard fare for a recruitable enemy and not really benefiting from the split. But Genealogy also has the substitute units, a failstate where if a given mother doesn't successfully meet the requirements to have kids in Gen 2, you instead get two similar units who have no relation to said mother. It's very easy to tell if a Fire Emblem fan has done a substitutes only run of Gen 2 because if they did it, they won't shut up about it. And the substitutes technically meet the criteria for an Arran-Samson since they're pairs of units where getting one locks you out of the other. Now, some would say that they don't count because they're roughly the same entity from a mechanical perspective, but according to the most reliable source, a Discord poll with 4 voters, they are an Arran-Samson pair. However, I disagree because I don't see substitutes and originals as Arran-Samson pairs, but instead see every potential father for the original as well as a substitute as a 14-unit Arran-Samson split. Though Thracia is where things get really complicated as far as what counts as an Arran-Samson pair, as rather than recruiting the units upfront in a single chapter, you instead pick between 2 routes that each have exclusive units. Ilios, Sloof, and Misha on the A route, and Shannon and Miranda on the B route. These units don't have many direct parallels with each other, which makes me not really see them as worth going over, although one of them arguably counts as an Arran-Samson pair with someone else who was recruited before the route split. Ilios Pizza is a commoner who is obsessed with claiming nobility in a way that's more so about having a title than doing anything impressive, and he's recruited by Karen on the condition that he can be made into a noble. But what the game doesn't tell you is that he's only willing to join if Olwen is dead or unrecruited, which I find interesting because she's the opposite of him, someone with a noble title who is forced to grapple with it not being all it's cracked out to be due to the actions of her brother Reinhardt and his toxic doomed yaoi partner Kempf. He's so self-absorbed and has such a shallow view of nobility that the mere presence of a noble who's gone through shit that challenges that view prevents him from joining. And sure, maybe this isn't a true Arran-Samson archetype, but archetypes aren't real, and I more so see this video as exploring a general design choice and a rigid set of criteria. There are 2 more traditional Arran-Samson pairs in Thracia's late game. In Chapter 22, you get the choice between Saias and Sad, both powerful magic units with a good deal of narrative importance. One is defined by his work under the shadows and is more so there for staff utility than combat, while the other is a visible symbol of hope with a big fleshy tome that he stole from Corpore, so the decision between the two adds some flavor to the endgame. But the choice I find more interesting in the context of Thracia is that of the 2 paladins, Amalda and Commodore, because it was already made for you, as both are recruited by a unit from the aforementioned route split, Sloof and Miranda respectively. You get these 2 in Chapter 19, where Leaf has to deal with the ramifications of a tactical error he made, and you have to get a bunch of units to safety in one of the largest size maps in the series. So adding to the sense of desperation that this map wants to convey is the fact that your main saving grace is something you don't really have a choice over. Also, Tiering Saga has points in the game where you choose between units outside of maps that count as Arran-Samsons. I have not played Tiering Saga yet for a variety of reasons, but I know this because ROM hacks really love to add it. As a game that largely takes second stabs at ideas from past Fire Emblems, Binding Blade has its own A vs B route split. This time chosen based on which of 2 villages you visit at the start of the Western Isles arc. Going A route gets you the hero Echidna and the dancer Layla, while going B route gets you the warrior Bartray and the bard Elfin, as the 2 refreshers would have prevented the game from functioning properly if you had access to both. But FE6 has a second A vs B route split where you go to either Ilia or Sacae based on how much EXP you dumped into the pair of classes that are most associated with those regions and get a pre-promote in that class line. The Falconite Juno for Ilia or the Nomadic Trooper Dayan for Sacae. FE6's approach to route splits is more so about adding flavor to individual playthroughs, and the most I can say about it narrative-wise is that it's cool that you're more likely to use a unit with personal stakes in Rorts and Arcado's doomed yaoi storyline, but hey, that's appreciated nonetheless. Blazing Sword, no I'm not calling it Blazing Blade, fuck you, also takes this approach to Arran-Samsons that's more so about the maps than the characters. Fourfang Defense is a completely different map depending on whether or not your 3 lords have met a certain experience threshold and affects which boss you'll fight in a later map. Depending on which version of the map you play, you'll either get Wallace, a general who previously appeared in Lynn's campaign, or Geitz, a warrior that's the older brother of a character from the prior game. Blazing Sword also has Pale Flower of Darkness, another map with a different layout based on a specific set of criteria that has its own Arran-Samson pair completely independent to said criteria. Depending on the version of the map you're playing, opening enough doors or killing enough pre-promotes will get you Karel, the bloodthirsty Swordmaster, while not doing that will get you Harken, the troubled hero. There is a parallel established between these two characters in how Harken is someone defined by wanting to move away from his dark past, while Karel is the dark past of a character from a previous game. And the knowledge that Karel will eventually get over himself by the time FE6 takes place adds a small bit of dramatic irony to all those Harken supports I did not feel like reading, despite the two characters seemingly having nothing to do with each other. Path of Radiance has two of these kinds of choices. There's Ina and her grandfather Nasir, two dragon lagoons who play a prominent role in the story, with both reluctantly serving Dayan due to the former's desire to reunite with her fiancé. They join at the beginning of the penultimate map, depending on whether or not you went out of your way to beat the Black Knight a couple chapters ago. Nasir, the one you get for beating the Black Knight, is just a straight up upgrade from Ina, and the idea of a better unit as a reward for an optional challenge would be cool, at least if said challenge didn't just boil down to, can I proc ether? The other choice is in the last map of the game, where you get to choose from 3 high-ranking lagoons. Nasala the Raven King, Giffca the Lion King Shadow, and even the King of the Hawks too, ah? Unlike the typical Arran-Samson split, there's an attempt here to expand these kinds of choices into ones that have an effect on the plot. These 3 are not only plot relevant, but given the significant mechanical role of being the rare units capable of damaging Ashnard. In fact, they will very likely be your main source of damage in the second phase, since I can easily get strength screwed and the 2 Dragon Lagoons have to work around that transformation gauge. Unfortunately though, the fact that these units only appear in a single map, not even a full one if you're playing on a hard enough difficulty, means that there's very little to differentiate the 3 mechanically. Even the skill system, something that should differentiate these units on paper, falls short here due to how little of their skills actually come into play in the final battle. Savior means nothing on a unit specifically there for combat, Roar has no effect on bosses, and Vantage isn't doing shit when Ashnard is just gonna 2-range Nasala on enemy phase. Compare this to the closest analog, the Saias vs. Dead choice, where one is more geared towards support and the other is more geared towards combat, so regardless of whichever one is better for metagame reasons, I'm not going to pretend to understand, there are clear reasons to have a preference for either. From here on, any Arran-Samson choice is debatable at best. Aside from the multiple 13-unit splits within Awakening, those ones are legit. Not only do the remakes retain the Arran-Samson choices from the originals, but FE11 even added a new optional chapter where you accrue the Divine Dragon Nagi as a failsafe in case you missed out on the 2 main methods of damaging the final boss. And sorry to disappoint Samuel Beckett, but visiting it locked you out of Godo. Paralog 13 of Awakening is a cute little tribute to these kinds of choices where you're caught in the middle of a conflict between 2 mercenary factions and pick one of them to be green units for the chapter. The Shora Boots choice, and also the Race and Renewal choice, are kind of like Arran-Samsons when you really think about them. And the Bad FE Wiki counts a pair of 3 Houses quests you'll immediately forget about as part of the Archetype. So this begs the question of why Arran-Samsons don't appear in FE games anymore, and I personally believe there's 2 reasons for that. First, games like Fates and 3 Houses being built around larger choices could have potentially played a role. There's actually an interview where it stated that Fates was based on scrap plans for FE1's Arran-Samson split to have a greater impact on the story, and I imagine it would be easy to see the more traditional Arran-Samsons as redundant in that case. Additionally, while this is an assumption from someone whose game design experience is just 40 hours of SRPG Studio, I also imagine that having multiple routes to account for would add some degree of difficulty in coding these units. See how Sacred Stones, the first FE to not have any Arran-Samson choices, is one with a fairly lengthy route split. But that doesn't exactly account for games like Engage, which lack those sorts of route splits. Because of that, I'd say the greater factor in the death of the Arran-Samson archetype is a broader shift in FE game design to put the characters at the forefront. What I mean by this isn't necessarily anything about the older game's characters, but rather that I have a 100% unfalsifiable hypothesis that a significant percentage of sales of these games can be directly attributed to edits of Tumblr posts with PNGs of the characters overlaid on top of them, and that at some point intelligent systems realize this. Like, I don't need to explain how supports, merits, side modes, and cosmetics lean into this, but the greater emphasis on how you build your units as mechanical entities reflects this too. Reclassing, skills, lectures, and emblem rings are there to create a greater level of investment into your favorite characters. All of this has a drastic impact on how units are handled. The casts are either smaller so as not to induce too much choice paralysis, or larger due to taking the everyone is here approach, where getting almost every unit from a prior game's cast is touted as a selling point. Getting units to your side has generally become easier with fewer and fewer recruitable enemies as time goes on. You're even given several methods of mitigating permadeath because there's a greater penalty for missing out on a unit. And I'm sure you'd imagine that a choice that ends with you getting locked out of at least one unit wouldn't exactly be seen as desirable within this design philosophy. What this is all to say is that the Arran-Samson archetype is a canary in a coal mine that I can point to as to which FEs I gravitate towards. When I played FE11 as a kid, my main experiences with RPGs up to that point were Pokemon, Bowser's Inside Story, a little bit of Dragon Quest, and the existentialist masterpiece Sonic Chronicles, so the idea that you couldn't just return to wherever you felt like whenever you wanted blew my mind. Of course, this was more so because of how little games in general I played at that point, and RPGs locking you out of content is fairly commonplace. But Fire Emblem's commitment to constantly preventing you from getting everything you want is a key factor in why it's so captivating to me. There is no such thing as 100% completion in Fire Emblem, or at least not in an individual playthrough of Fire Emblem. And the game looking you dead in the eye to tell you there's at least one unit you're not getting is the finest example of that. I know it's common practice for these kinds of retrospective video essays to end on a note like, I wonder what they'll do in the next game. That's not really my style. I try to divorce myself from the constant desire for more and more and be content with what's already available rather than what could hypothetically come next. When it comes to the topic of new entries in game franchises I have some investment in, I see it as either I actively do not want them to continue this, or they're going to continue this no matter how I feel, so if it ends up being good, I won't complain. Some unimportant guy once said, desire is the root of all suffering, and I'm pretty sure he was talking about video games there. So I don't really care about the death of this hyper-specific part of the series, because if I desperately needed it, I could always go back to the games that have it. And if I was somehow placed under a curse where I'll die if I don't play a new Fire Emblem game that has an Arran-Samson archetype in it, then ROM hacks would be a pretty good loophole. As I alluded to earlier, there are several hacks, particularly ones in the telephone format, that have taken notes from Tearing Saga's spin on the archetype. I also heard that the most recent hack by prolific FE Universe user Nikita Khrushchev had a crazy Arran-Samson involving two units named Sino and Soviet. But regardless, I just think the Arran-Samson archetype is pretty neat. That's all for today, but you can find another video on the Arran-Samson archetype by my friend Danny Doyle. Not only do I imagine that her greater investment in the metas of FEs would give her video a different feel from mine, but she also has her own theories as for why the archetype could have died. Though neither of us has seen the other's video until the date of upload so as not to compromise the originality of our work, so I don't know how similar they are to mine. For all I know, she could have dedicated an entire part of the video to how she supports cutting people's limbs off and watching them slowly and painfully bleed to death over the course of 10 minutes. And in that case, I would not endorse that because I'd rather those people slowly and painfully bleed to death over the course of 20 minutes instead.